You show me your friends, and I tell you your destiny. What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. What is wrong or not so wrong with today's schooling, K to 12? There's a lot of talk about how our school system fails us. And there are always ways in which we can improve. And that's the same with democracy, that's the same with everything. Nothing is perfect, because if it is, then it becomes an ideology, an utopian world that we really can't really afford to live in, because it means that we have to think a certain way. And what happens is that we end up in a totalitarian regime that happens, in the Soviet Union, where millions of people were killed. So therefore, it's always a process. So with the school system. If I, for example, look at the school system here in Quebec, it's incredibly well and thoroughly thought through. Now, there are a lot of critics who say, well, we should not do this, we should not do that, and there's a lot of ideology or not, and so on and so forth. So you can pick always a side, and you can always find ways of improving it. The bottom line is, though, that the most important actor is ultimately the one who conveys the curriculum, and who decides and who instills the hunger for learning in students. And what we ultimately want is one thing. We want to have the success of our children, because the success of our children means also the success of and the continuous success of, for example, Quebec society, which is just an amazing place to be. I mean, Quebec is just, it's unbelievable, okay? And it's a lot of politics too, and that's part of it, right? There's a lot of politics, and because it has such a rich, incredible, rich, fascinating history. There's so many different people. There are indigenous people, Inuit, and they're all kind of different people. Wonderful. So there's no really better place to live in the world, according to my way of thinking, than really, for example, in Quebec. It's just beautiful. Now, there's always the battle of, oh, it works or it doesn't work. For some it works, for some it doesn't. But the most important thing that always gets forgotten is that no matter what we decide on in terms of the curriculum, for example, ultimately what really matters is instilling, as I mentioned, the hunger and thirst for continuous learning. And one aspect of it is really instilling, first and foremost, the belief in children and really in the population in general, the love for learning, the love for doing things just for doing it, the process, embracing the process of living, because the process of living is simply learning. As Hess, for example, he is at Columbia University, he wrote a book, Learn or Die, and he defined learning in a very specific and a very powerful way. In other words, the small disturbances really make us grow and learn. In other words, there's a stimulus and there is a response. And every time we face something in our life, we always adjust and become a little bit more nuanced. And that the same happens when we watch and listen to the news, right? So the more you learn, the more knowledge you gain, and the more you're able to integrate the knowledge, the more nuanced you become in your analysis. In other words, it's really hard then for you to just say, these are the bad and these are the good guys. You can, from whatever perspective you look at a problem, a policy, or a political challenge, from different angles, and different angles will give you different answer to the problem. And ultimately, when it comes down to political discourse, there's never really that political parties necessarily disagree on the problem itself, only on how we address the problem to the best of our ability in order to improve society. And that's really what it is. So that's first and foremost very important. So I just want to lay the context, because oftentimes this really gets missed out, and we start having those political battlegrounds which are by and large useless, because they don't really help. No, they actually do. They also are necessary, because precise these are these disturbances, right, that make us rethink certain things. And that's what Willie Peterson said, right? So a organic organism never does really change. You can't change it in its very core, but you can disturb it in order for the organism to change itself. And that's Willie Peterson, the professor of the practice of management at the Columbia University, an incredible man who wrote the book, the Inside Story, Leadership, the Inside Story. So I really recommend to buying this incredible book by Willie Peterson, an outstanding scholar, human being, and mind really of our time. So that's also one thing, just as an aside. Always make sure you listen and you imitate the great. And Willie Peterson is one of these incredible great people that still walk the earth. So school has to change all the time. Every single decade we have these discourses, which obviously makes sense. Now, let's zoom out. The most important thing to me is that, yes, you can always make an argument for changing the curriculum and making it differently for different learners. And I fully agree that. And I think that's the responsibility for the teacher. But the most important aspect and in the process is obviously the child, and second is the teacher, that the teacher really instills the fundamental belief in each and every child that it can succeed no matter what. If someone struggles in math or in languages or whatever it is, that ought to be seen as a process, and the kid should be made to believe truly that yes, he's struggling, but the process is the way. It is a process, time and again. And that's really what schooling is that ultimately it is the best emotional and psychological everyday gym for our youngest generation. Because if you can instill in young people and make them believe that, hey, this is the hardest part of their lives, because they can't really be very creative. It's very structured. Most young people, including myself, suffer through K-12. But if you have a teacher who is able to instill the belief that, hey, no matter what, this will ultimately grow your emotional and psychological muscles, because you do 5 times a week something that you don't like. Now think about it, after 12 years, everything becomes ultimately a cakewalk, because the hardest part of shaking a human mind is really at the very beginning. And the more and more a teacher is able to instill this in a child, the more it starts losing the fear of making mistakes, because mistakes are really the chief trigger, and that's really Peterson, the chief triggers of learning. Again, stimuli and response, and within there is a process. And if we can instill that continuously and just instill the belief you can, it doesn't matter, you only produce results. Like as Wayne Dyer said, he said, no matter what you do, you always produce results. It's just a result. Or as Alan J. Langer said, it's like, for her, the process of being creative and painting starts only once she does and makes the first mistake. Why? Because it sets you free. And then you try time and again, and you get more and more courageous. And then you ultimately embrace it. It's like playing sports, for example. You shoot time and again. You get better and better and better. And therefore you have a coach or a teacher who points out certain ways of potentially improving your learning, you're doing things, right? Playing hockey or doing math or whatever it is. So really, role of the teacher is so important. Time and again, because that's what really is. And then we will always have a debate about what we should learn and what we should not learn. However, overall, we have to have at least some common ground, upon which a society is built upon, right? That we have, roughly speaking, the same information so we can judge the society and its history. And we don't judge history by today's standard. We judge history by its specific time period. Because otherwise, it's so easy in hindsight. We always knew better. It's so easy to tell our grandfathers, well, you did, or you messed up, or whatever. I mean, it's so easy. And so will we be told by our grandchildren that we completely messed up. Why? Because that's science, right? It's a process. Science is simply the enterprise of correcting mistakes. And that's history as well. But of course, very important, we got to learn from history. And so that's my point. And therefore, I think schooling can always be improved, of course. And the more mindful as a teacher become, and especially the more we tap into the potential of instilling this belief, because we know it works. If you believe in a child, the same neural networks really get light up in the child's head. And that's demonstrated now in different study in neuroscience, for example. Libretto and all, they did a study that really, whatever you focus on, your brain value system also will get light up. In other words, there's a correlation between the two. So that means that you really have to pay attention of what you're paying attention to. Because that means, implicitly speaking, that that's what you value. And that really makes completely sense, because as a great saying says, is that it goes something along the line like this. You show me your friends and I tell you your destiny. So therefore, really be careful of what you pay attention to, and really pay attention to what's really important, what really you want to become. Therefore, look how the greats really do, what they do on a consistent basis. And the most simple, most effective step is really to start looking first at the list that you never ever want to become. That's very easy, because then it's also the pyramid, you just divide it already, because already 50% you're sure what you do not want to become. So therefore, just don't do the things that you don't want to do. For example, look at people that you really, really don't like first, for example, and then just make sure that you don't do what they are doing. For example, judging other people's, calling them out, and always pointing out other people's fault, rather than looking inward and first and foremost look at actually what you can actually improve now, first and foremost, in order for you to really make yourself and your life truly a masterpiece. Yes, schooling will be always political. There's a lot of things that we can improve, but first and foremost, I think the curriculum is so broad that the teacher can make such an incredible difference. And therefore, if you're a teacher, take back really your destiny, because it's in your hand. You can teach within the curriculum really however you want. It's really, really open. So to say that it's somehow restrained in terms of creativity? No, because as Rousseau also said in Emil actually, scarcity also breeds creativity. Because if you have everything, then why should you be creative? Because you already have something. But look at the children, for example, who don't have like a soccer ball. Well, they become very creative. They start patching a soccer ball together and they play. And that's also creativity. So it always depends on where your focus is going. So short schooling, yes, it's always political. It will always be subject to improvement, and that equals to life. In other words, it's simply a reflection of society. And society, as well as schooling, or quotation mark education, which really comes from the Latin word educato, which means develop from within, will never be perfect. There are always different ways, and that's really part of the amazing society we live in, because it's all about diversity. We all have different thoughts and ways of looking at the world, and by incorporating as many perspectives as possible, the more sound we become and holistic. And therefore, I have no doubt that we will continuously improving our education system, our wonderful people and fellow human beings, because life is simply beautiful. Thank you so much, and talk to you soon. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.the-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.